Gentleman from Richmond City, Ms. McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise for a point of personal privilege.
The gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I want to echo a little bit of what the gentlelady from Sussex said in talking about the importance of Black History Month. But I want to give you a little bit bigger context. I had a conversation with Governor McDonald a couple years ago where he asked, how are we doing with race relations in Virginia? And I said, we've come a long way, but now there's something even more dangerous than racism and the open hatred that we saw in the past. We now are fighting a problem of ignorance. We are fighting a problem where too many people, this part is not the problem, but it leads to the problem. A lot of people now have been born after Jim Crow. A lot of people in this body were born and grew up after Jim Crow. We have a lot of children, and I had a lot of hope when last year there was a documentary about the sit-in at Tallheimer's, and they interviewed students from today and students from that walk-in. And what gave me hope was when a young girl said, I cannot fathom a day when someone was spit on because they dared to sit at a lunch counter at Woolworth and they happened to be Black. And it is good that we've come past those days. But what is dangerous is too many people don't fully appreciate that the impacts of Jim Crow still exist today, and that many of the laws that we propose that look like a good idea to solve what may be a legitimate problem will have a disproportionate impact on the very same people that Jim Crow impacted. And I want to give you some examples. Now first, we heard some stories yesterday about people, what happened when they tried to exercise their right to vote. And I told you the story 2 years ago of my great-grandfather who studied and took a literacy test and passed it and had the registrar turn to his assistant and say, we need more questions because this blank got them all right, and they were determined not to register him to vote. So for many Virginians, it's personal. Every member of the Legislative Black Caucus, either themselves or a member of their family, had something awful happen to them or someone they know simply because of the color of their skin. And much of that was not only sanctioned, but required by law. Every one of you has a constituent. Something terrible happened to them or their family, sanctioned by law. Let me tell you a little bit. How many of you have heard of the Racial Integrity Act of 1924? How many of you have heard of Dr. Walter Plecker? Well, I am Dr. Plecker's worst nightmare. Dr. Plecker was part of the white supremacy movement and worked very hard to convince Virginia to pass the Racial Integrity Act. Now, in the 1600s, Virginia had outlawed interracial marriage. And in 1912, Virginia required birth registrations by law, primarily to enforce making sure that whites and blacks didn't marry. Guess who the head of the Department of the Bureau of Vital Statistics was? Dr. Plecker. He saw what in his mind was too many non-whites, either mixed-race people, light-skinned blacks, or Native Americans, who he felt were trying to pass as white or intermingle the races. He convinced the General Assembly to pass the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which required not only birth registrations, but listed only 2 races on the birth certificate, white or black. And guess who was in a position to enforce that law? Dr. Plecker, and enforce it he did. If you came to the Department of Vital Statistics to seek a birth certificate. And many people, particularly in the 40s, as we started to see more laws that require proof of citizenship, came to get either a delayed birth certificate or to get a birth certificate for a family member who was born before, this is as late as 1946. If you were Native American, and there are many Pamunkey Indians who walked in that office and wanted a birth certificate, and they saw white or black, and they said, I'm neither. And Dr. Plecker said, you're black. And that Pamunkey Indian said, no, I'm not. I'm a Pamunkey Indian. And he said, you are black. And if you don't check that box, you will not get a birth certificate. If you had my parents walked in there, I mean, you can look at me and tell I'm of mixed race. If my parents had walked in and said, we're not checking either one of those boxes, I wouldn't have had a birth certificate. If I had gone in and not checked white or black, my son wouldn't have had a birth certificate. This happened as late as 1946. So when the gentleman from Manassas asked yesterday or made a comment, show me the evidence of why seniors wouldn't have a birth certificate or an ID. The legacy of Dr. Plecker means there are people in Virginia today who, if they had to prove their citizenship, if they had to present a birth certificate to get a government-issued photo ID, they couldn't do it. So when you see some of the immigration bills that we have that require proof of citizenship, you think about the Virginians, and I think it's probably about 11%, who were born while Dr. Plecker was in charge of giving out birth certificates. And he was in that position from 1912 to 1946. And you think about, with the legacy of Dr. Plecker and the Racial Integrity Act, how many Virginians today could not prove they were U.S. citizens? You think about how many today could not produce a birth certificate and get a government-issued photo ID. And some say, well, you can go pay for an ID. But due to some of the other legacies we had of poll taxes, you need to realize how government-sanctioned racism affects many people still today. Now, the good news of the story was the Racial Integrity Act was invalidated in Loving versus Virginia. And as a result, I was able to marry the man that I love. And today, when my son was born, I didn't have to argue what box needed to be checked just for him to get a birth certificate. But again, think of how many Virginians born as late as 1946 weren't so lucky. So the next time someone says, and when you realize the legacy that we have, not just in voting, not just in marriage laws, but all across the board, and you see some of the passion that you saw yesterday at the Bell Tower and in here, you need to understand that for many Virginians, these scars are still festering, and it doesn't take much to open them and make them bleed. Whether it's a proclamation made in honor of Confederate History Month that unintentionally excludes what to many people the Civil War was all about, or whether it's a bill that looks to prevent voter fraud, think about how the legacy of Jim Crow and government-sanctioned racism in Virginia impacts Virginians today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.